Did you know Variety, the children's charity, is the entertainment charity started by a group of show business people who found an abandoned baby in a theatre way back in 1928. These kind-hearted performers raised so much money to help the lost child that they began helping other children, and Variety, the children's charity, was born. Read the full story and support the entertainers charity that supports kids in need today. Visit variety.org.au. You're listening to the School of Hard Knock Knocks podcast with me, Maury Morgan.
Ladies and gentlemen, your next comedian.
Shouldn't drink on an empty head, you know that, don't you?
That is the shittiest heckle I have ever heard in my life.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
That's a bucket list.
You have dangerously underprepared yourself for the shit that is about to get real.
Perth-born James Masters cut his comedy teeth in Vancouver, Canada. A hot room, a serendipitous moment, and before James knew it, he was a professional Canada-based comedian, albeit a little rougher around the edges than today's Australia-based comic. In this podcast episode, you'll hear how accents and cultural differences are an early comedian's advantage and create a shroud of forgiveness unique to foreign comedians. James also shares how to write stand-up like a Nazi, his 1:6 ratio of great to crap content, how he remembers his sets, word economy, and the importance of self-promotion. If you're a stand-up comedian or want to be and have global domination plans, then you'll love this interview with James Masters.
Last relationship was like a shitty relationship. You know? we were a shit couple. You know what I'm talking about? Like one of those couples that just walks around being all shitty, you know? Arguing about nothing. Yeah, we're one of those. And we had this big argument right before we broke up. And I tried to smooth things over with her by buying her a vibrator. I thought it was a nice gesture, okay? She didn't think so at all. She just made this huge deal of the fact that I bought it secondhand. That's very much how she reacted, actually. She's like, gross, James. That's fucking gross. That's been in someone else's vagina. And I was like, yeah, well, fucking so have I.
G'day, James. How are you?
Yeah, good. How you doing?
Oh,
Mark?
very good. James, now, you're not in Western Australia as we speak. You're actually in Melbourne, but you are originally from WA, I believe.
Yeah, from Perth. I spent most of my 20s overseas, but now I'm close to Perth, sort of close to my family, but not too close. So it's a good distance, I feel like.
So you're saying Melbourne's close to Perth compared to where you were, which was in Canada, I believe. 5 years?
Yeah. I was in Canada doing comedy for 5 years until about 2013, and before that I was in England not doing comedy, just wasting time. Yeah,
like all Australians are required to do. I think it's...
it's sort of a rite of passage, really.
That and a footy trip to Bali.
Yeah, sure.
Very good. So WA, I mean, we kind of rip on Perth and WA generally, but there's a lot of good comedians, a lot of great comedians. Rove McManus, I know Dave Callan, although Irish originally, grew up in Perth, and yourself, James. So what is it about Perth that does create high-quality comedians? That's important, high quality.
I don't really know. You have a lot of really good comics from Perth, Laura Davis is from Perth and Xavier Michaelides. These are sort of my contemporaries. Joel Creasy's from Perth. There's a lot of pretty successful people from Perth, but there's sort of this mentality in Perth comedy that you have to leave to get anywhere, and I think it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think if everybody had stayed, there'd be a very good scene, and from there they could achieve something without leaving Perth. But because everyone leaves because they believe it to be true, it is true. So at any one time, there's never more than a few good comedians in Perth because they leave so quickly. As soon as they get their legs, or as soon as they feel like they're ready to go pro in a big way, they generally leave. There's not a lot of TV and radio opportunities over there, unfortunately. It kills me because I love Perth, but you do have to leave to further your comedy career.
Well, that being said, and we're going on a slight tangent, I just found out Peter Rosethorn, who's a great comedian and the Comedy Company and Kath and Kim, and he's actually based in Perth now. Yeah. So he's done the other thing. I don't know, is it his sea change of Perth?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I would love it if there was a bit of a revival. I think the scene, when I first started, the scene seemed quite strong then. I don't know if it was like more just my point of view. I hadn't done comedy, so every comedian seemed really impressive to me back then. And but I swear to God, it was a very strong scene. Like, you had all those people I mentioned, Ben Russell, I can't think of names off the top of my head, but it seemed like there were a lot of people doing really good stuff at the time.
Yep.
Whereas everybody inevitably left, and so it sort of ebbs and flows. How many good comedians? Like, sometimes they all band together and stay a little bit longer, but it's never long before they head to Sydney or Melbourne, it seems.
There we go.
Which is crazy, because the ones that stay have the lion's share of these really well-paid kids.
Yeah, true. So you're saying that Perth is like Melbourne back in the 80s?
I don't know.
I might be saying that.
I wasn't in Melbourne in the 80s, and for some of the 80s I wasn't even alive. So it'd be crazy for me to make that comment.
Well, I have heard that at one point, certainly in the 80s and early 90s, there was more rooms than comedians, but that might just be in our days when I was young, kind of stories from some of the older comedians.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know many comedians that were sort of active in Australia in the 80s. Ostentatious, or was that the 90s? That was the 80s.
Yeah, the 80s would have been, yeah.
I couldn't tell you many, though. Not more than like a handful.
Yeah, well, there would
not more than 5. No
Elliot
way.
Goblet, Jack Levi would have been one.
Oh yeah, I don't know Elliot Goblet, but I've seen him on posters at the airport urinal.
Yeah, I actually interviewed him recently.
I can book him for a corporate.
I know. I recently interviewed him for this podcast, and I off air didn't raise that issue with him publicly, but did say, I did see him as I took a pee after getting off a flight from Sydney, and hence why we're having that conversation. I think a very good reminder.
We'll say what you like, and obviously it works. Everyone knows him. They knows he's an available corporate comedian, because at the airport everyone needs to wink, right?
That is true. But in his defence, he said that he paid for that years ago, and so obviously they've just kept the posters up there and haven't replaced them with anyone else. So
I don't think he needs to defend it. It's brilliant. I wish I'd thought of it.
Well, we're talking about every other comedian except the one that I'm interviewing right now, which is, of course, James Masters. Now, James, at the outset of this recording, I played a little snippet from, I believe it's a golden oldie, one of your great jokes. It was the secondhand dildo joke. It was hilarious.
Yeah, that's that's got a pretty good hit rate, that joke. So I still do it even now, which I should be moving well past that joke, really, and be writing better stuff, but I'm not really. It's just I still really like doing that joke, and I find I can go from that joke to any joke about relationships, because it's just sort of a silly introduction to a bad relationship.
Well, that's fantastic, and it's a good segue for probably my first question here, which is paid gigs. So my understanding is that you were in Perth and then you went to Canada, and you were only meant to be there for a short amount of time, but you ended up being there for 5 years. And you got you bit your what's the expression? You cut your teeth in Canada. Which part of Canada, by the way?
Vancouver, the most beautiful city I've ever seen.
Oh, was it? Even more so than Sydney is.
Oh, way more. And the people, unlike Sydney, are very pleasant.
Well, we apologise to anyone from Sydney listening to this podcast. We do like you. So on that note, then you cut your teeth in Vancouver, the nicest place in the world apparently, and most beautiful. Isn't that a bit of a handicap though? I mean, because the rest of the world ain't so nice and pretty.
How so?
Well, I don't know. I'm assuming you popped into the US a couple of times, maybe New York, and then got pissed on and screamed at and shouted at.
No. In terms of comedy, it was similar to everywhere else. It was just physically very beautiful. But
and the people being nice.
I think like a lot of people in Vancouver think that it's particularly PC in Vancouver, but I also think that every city thinks that, and the reality is that the Western world is just way more PC than it was 10 years ago.
Right. And that leads me to the question, which is about your paid gig. So did you start comedy here in Australia, or did you start in Vancouver?
I did, I think 3 or 4 gigs in Perth at this. My first gig I ever did, I heard they still run it. It's this show called Shapiro Tuesdays. It's a night specifically set up for new comedians or established comedians trying new stuff. That was the idea when I first started. And I heard about that, and I'd always liked stand-up. And I thought, well, if I'm not going to do it now, then I'll never do it. So I'll just bloody better bite the bullet and give it a go. And it went amazingly well. It's a very hot room, a very easy room, and a very receptive crowd. And but I didn't know that. I just thought I was very good. And I think that's key to any comedy career, is the first few gigs going well. If they don't, you're going to need this in my life, and you just quit straight away. So they went well, and then I travelled around America for 6 months, thinking that when I settled in Vancouver, which I eventually did, I would get started again.
So your paid gig would have been Canada then, was it?
It was, yeah. How
did that go?
It was great, and the way I got it was even greater. There was this really amazing comedian who is Australian born, I think. His name's Peter Kalamis, and he's sort of a legend of Canadian comedy, certainly. And he's done TV and things like this. And he was booking a corporate gig for an advertising agency, I think it was. And instead of just taking anyone's word for anything, he actually went down to a comedy show, just a sort of an amateur comedy show, and just picked a couple of his favourite comedians from that night, and I happened to be one of them. And I was really chuffed and really flattered to be asked. And then the gig itself was great, and I think I made $75, which was so great at the time. And
probably got a couple of free beers thrown in too.
I reckon I might have, yeah. So yeah, that was really cool. And they did a photo shoot for it, and they had posters and everything, and I felt like a real superstar for the first time ever after that.
And on that note then, I kind of alluded to it a bit earlier. Is there a difference in doing comedy to a Canadian crowd than, say, to an Australian crowd?
Yeah, definitely. I would say they laugh at different things, and if you ever try to go straight from one country to the other thinking that the same set will fly, you're a rude shock. Some things just don't work with the sensibility of one country or another. I'm not smart enough to put it exactly into words. You just got to figure it out by trial and error. It's like, Canadian.
Well, if we go back to your dildo joke, you talk about the dollar shop in that gag, which I don't think we have dollar shops, but we all know what a dollar shop is in Australia. But we'd have the reject shop, wouldn't we?
Yeah, but more fundamental than that. That particular joke went very well in Canada, but was considered too mean by Australian audiences.
Too mean. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was just too mean. I think, didn't I say that online dating was like shopping at a dollar store or a reject shop? Yeah, I think that was the joke, which I wouldn't write that and I wouldn't do that now anyway. But I found out very quickly that there were jokes like that were too mean for Melbourne, and I just seemed like a bit of a dick. And I think I got away with more because I had an accent. And they're like, he's Australian. He probably doesn't know any better. It's funny because he's different.
Yeah.
So I think what I was able to get away with was different when I moved to Melbourne, and it's made me a better comedian, I think, because I had to think a bit harder about how I was being perceived and a little bit about my actual voice and not just, the amount of gags I was doing.
Well, going back a step on the accent, we have a lot of people who do the School of Hard Knocks comedy course, which is a 5-day course. We've had just in the last 3 months, we've had Scottish, very strong Scottish accents, Italian, again, very strong Italian accents, English, sort of northern English. And they're all those three that I just mentioned were actually some of the best comedians we've had. Does having an accent help in, like you described?
I would say it does. I think audiences are able to relax a bit more and they just like the novelty of it. Yep. And I found that I was able to almost play a character in Canada, a character of a loud, blustering Australian dickhead. Whereas when I came over to Melbourne, I just was Australian dickhead. So I had to it was no longer seemed like a character. I would say my voice changed fairly dramatically over a short period of time because it was either that or just, get a day job and forget about comedy.
So were you enunciating with the Australian crowd and being very ochre with the Canadian?
Not so much that. It was more the way I was being perceived. I started consciously trying to be more likable to Australian crowds, whereas I would frown and stomp around the stage, and everyone found that funny in Canada because they're like, "Oh, he's just an Australian idiot," and this is funny. But when I say voice, I don't literally mean voice. I mean the way you're perceived or the way you develop your comedy style.
You're talking from a perspective of a director talking to an actor in that sense.
I guess I am. Yeah, I'm not sure who imbued me with that voice idea, but it would have been someone in Canada.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, that kind of moves into my next question, but it sounds like in Australia you have to be more humble. And when I did my research on you, the word humility came up quite a lot, that people associate you with humility. Is that what you were becoming? You were becoming a more humble comedian in Australia because of the audience expectations?
Is it possible, Maury, that you're referring to the fact that I did a show called The King of Humility?
Well, there's that, but then I also, unless the journalist who wrote the next story was just lazy, as I was, and repeated a message that had been written previously. But that being said, I want to add, on your website, your jamesmasters.com.au, I believe, it just says that you are a very good comedian, not an excellent comedian. So, I mean, I double checked my research, and I confirm you are incredibly humble.
Well, I like to under-promise and over-deliver. So when talking about one, so if I say I'm an excellent comedian, do
people actually introduce you as? And here he is, a very good comedian.
I'd actually be more comfortable with pretty good. I'll tell you a story. I won't tell any names, but one time when I first got to Melbourne, I went down to the club in North Melbourne, and a friend of mine said, I'll talk you up to the booker there. Yep. And so I went, oh, great, that'll be a perfect little introduction. And so I came down, and I was standing and waiting for my introduction, and he goes, oh, this is James, he's pretty good. So I was like, oh, great, that was a waste of a goddamn night. I don't know. It seems funny to me that I could write anything about myself, but I've chosen to go with pretty good.
Oh, well, humble. And you talk a lot about having rejected women in your life. Well, you've rejected them or they've rejected you in your life. So obviously, I don't know, maybe humble doesn't work in your personal life.
Well, I think most of the stories are about me being the person that got rejected. I think it's this comes back to the likable thing. If I talked about how I reject women and I'm some kind of love master, and that's not very likable. So I would never try to put that across. I think that would be a very unlikable thing to do.
Oh, good. Okay, so I think we've got an example that you were trying to find earlier.
Also, for the record, the vast majority of relationships in my life, I was the one that got rejected. So no problem there. No problem there.
And if I understand correctly, you're now in a relationship.
I am. I'm engaged now. So I'm hoping the rejections are behind me, Maury.
Yeah. Well, there's that, but you've got to have to write a lot more material, or just not invite anyone to the wedding, I guess. So we don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. You bang on there.
Yeah. All right, you're eloping.
I've been trying to think of jokes for the wedding, and I'm like, no one else would think like that. They would just say something genuine about the person they love, and that would be the speech. But I'm trying to write it like it's a comedy set, which is really. I should reassess that.
And she hasn't drawn a line in the sand and said, James,
no jokes. No jokes at the wedding. Yeah. No. She would, but I think I got to self-police there.
That's a good segue into my next question, which is about generating content. So the people that listen to this podcast, they might have writer's block at the moment, and they're going, "Oh God, I need inspiration. James, help me." What are ways, apart from having failed relationships, how do you generate new content?
Okay, so I actually have a really good system now, and I learned this from a fantastic Canadian comic called John Bueller. He wrote an article maybe must have been 6 years ago or something, and it was called How to Write Stand-Up Comedy Like a Nazi. And he talked about how you can really efficiently collect all your ideas and filter them down into this process and write them all out. And so basically, whenever anything occurs to you that's funny, whether it's a funny turn of phrase or a funny thing that happened to you, what I find often is if something annoys me, and I'm quite easily annoyed, there's usually an underlying reason for it that a normal person would find funny. So I'll write everything down in my phone. I've just got a note in my phone called New Ideas, and there's always just a big pile of bullshit. But in there somewhere will be some usable ideas. And it would be an incident that I witnessed that I can maybe heighten the reality a little and tell it as a joke, or something that annoys me and I've figured out why and it's probably funny somehow. And then from there, I'll take the ideas and put them into a Word file and write them out in full. If they're good, they go into a new document called Good. And if they work on stage, then they get filed by subject into a comedy file. So at all times, this big comedy file where every joke I've ever written is categorized by subject. So if you need half an hour of jokes on relationships, I can deliver. Although some of them will be absolute horse shit because I wrote them 5 years ago and they're no longer good or whatever. But, that's the theory anyway.
Okay, good. So you got a lot of. So if you were to do every joke in real time, not rushing through, but performing it as you would in an audience, how many hours would you have?
Oh, well, I would never do every joke in there in real time.
Guinness Book of Records contacts you.
It would take 6 hours to do it.
Oh, that's amazing.
But I would never do that.
No,
that would be there'd be so much crap in there. I reckon I have club ready, really good club jokes. I wouldn't think I'd have more than maybe 2 hours. Yep. So I reckon I'll be humble. I'll say an hour of really good club jokes. But then even then, I can only commit about 45 minutes to memory at any one time, unless I'm doing a festival and it's sort of like muscle memory after a while.
Okay. Well, that's a good look. You've given the audience a good ratio, like a 1 to 6 ratio, roughly, of comedy. So if they're planning on doing, we've got people who listen to this and they're going to do their first Melbourne International Comedy Festival or Perth Fringe or Adelaide Fringe. Now they know. So that's a very good ratio that you've given us. You just alluded to a very big challenge, and that is, you can't take notes up on stage when you're performing at a festival. So how do you remember even 45 minutes of material?
Yeah. Well, it's usually, like I said, it's usually just muscle memory. But I put little triggers on the back of my left hand. And I think a lot of people do that now. A lot of people in my sort of generation, but then there are a lot of people that frown on it as well. I know a lot of the old road dogs in Melbourne roll their eyes and say it's stupid and amateur. I don't really give a shit, though.
Yep.
It's just the way I've always done it, and will always do it. And no one knows, and it's also the same hand that my watch is on. So I usually say really clumsily, "Oh, what's the time?" if I'm struggling for my next idea. But it very rarely happens. It's like a security blanket having it on the back of my left hand.
Well, unfortunately, from now on, anyone who hears this podcast and sees you is going to be watching you. So you've ruined that.
I'll tell you what, they'd be wise to it anyway, because whenever I do that, comedians at the back of the room crack up laughing at my paper thin room.
There you go. Oh, well, I knew a guy, and I know a guy very well. He's actually one of the co-founders of the School of Hard Knock Knocks, and he just when he introduces the next comedian who's a newcomer, who's not famous, he puts them on his mobile phone. His name is Ben Horowitz. I'll be transparent.
Oh, yes.
And but then he makes a joke about the mobile phone. So he has that that segue from trying to remember a name into a good gag. All right, well, excellent.
Yeah, it's a nice little device. You pretend that you're active, but then it turns out you don't at all. And it's great.
Bingo. So aside from that little piece of advice about writing small triggers near your watch, is there any other advice that you'd like to give up-and-comers? Because, it's always good to have more competition in comedy.
Well, are you talking about to have a career in comedy or to be funny? Because they're two different things.
Well, look, let's what would you prefer to share? Which is more
if you want to be funny, I reckon just get as much stage time as you possibly can and honestly assess how every joke's going. And so really turn the screws on the jokes that are working so you can just optimize, just get the most amount of laughter in the smallest amount of time. The word economy is good. Don't say a goddamn word unless it's leading to the next punchline.
Yep. And
test it constantly. And if it's not working, just F it off and write something new. As far as career goes, I would say spend as much time working on your jokes as you do trying to promote yourself. This is one of my big weaknesses. You got to be good with social media. You got to be good with talking to people that are in the industry. You got to be I don't know. It's just good to be social in that world, and you got to know who's making the decisions and who's booking the good gigs and who's pulling the strings in the management companies and things like that. And you got to ask for things. You can't just sit around waiting for someone to give you a tap. You got to actually put yourself on the line, apply for comedy writing jobs, apply for try to get whatever gig you want, actually ask for it. Don't wait for someone to approach you, and don't just sit there getting bitter because you're not on the cool shows or whatever it is.
Well, that's wise. So don't sit staring at the phone waiting for it to ring. Bingo.
Yeah. The guys that seem to do really well at the top end of comedy, they're obviously funny, but they're just as good at the business side and at knowing what the next step is, and it is a business, and you got to treat it like that to some extent.
Yeah, right. Well, talking about business, the comedy lockdown. This is your little side hustle.
Oh, Yeah, I mean, little's definitely the operative word. Right now it's just one show. It's a really great show, but it's a monthly show in Albury that gets a really good crowd. But it started, the idea of it, and I may well go back to putting some more time into it, but the idea of it was when I first got to Melbourne, I was staggered at the lack of road work that comedians had available. In Canada, the bread and butter of almost every headliner was getting on the road and doing these small town gigs, and and it was so fun too. Like, you'd get 3 comedians together and you'd just hit the road for 2 weeks, and there'd be a show every night, and you'd drink and you'd party. It was great. When I was in my mid-20s, that was the ideal thing. But there's a few small town gigs in Melbourne, but very few real tours and things. So I was trying to sort of address that and set up more road gigs with Comedy Lockdown. And at one point we had about 4 going simultaneously, but my problem is I kept getting sidetracked with other projects and was never able to give it enough love. So right now it's back to just this Albury show. But it's a cracking show. It's really enjoyable.
Well, fantastic. When's the next one?
It's the first Friday of every month, so I believe it's December 1st. And we've got Mike Goldstein headlining. He's great.
Very good. I've got to get him on this podcast too. Yeah, I've seen Mike. In fact, I think I saw him at the last Melbourne International Comedy Festival. Very funny guy. It's always good. He's American, isn't he?
He is, yeah. He's from
American living in a... Yeah. I always like Americans who live in Australia. They just, as an American comedian, they just seem to get both sides. And
yeah, I mean, there's definitely a level of insight. It's an interesting point of view having an American here, because I think they see things about Australian culture that perhaps we miss, largely.
That's true. What other gigs do you have coming up?
You know what? I don't know. I don't have a lot going on within Melbourne's city limits right now. I've got a lot of suburban gigs for sports clubs and charities, and a few regional gigs. But I'm spending more time writing, just for the last couple of months, writing non-stand-up projects. So I'm sort of taking a slight hiatus. But if you're in Albury, Wodonga, slim chance, but definitely come down and see the last show of the year at the Albion Hotel on Dean Street, December 1st.
That's a good. I will. I'll be a little bit north of that 2 days later, which will be in Wagga Wagga. But I might pass through. On the 3rd. We're actually running our first Wagga Wagga School of Hard Knock stand-up comedy school in New South Wales. Actually, we've gone to Wagga.
There's a really good show up in Wagga Wagga, I think.
Dane Simpson from Riverina. Yep.
That's the guy. Yeah, he's a legend. Yeah, I went to the footy with him once. But yeah, he was. That's by all accounts, that's a very good show. Yeah,
he's good. Yeah, in fact, he's so good that we invited him into our little clan there, or into the mob, as it would be better terminology. And so he's helping out with Chris Franklin, and we've got Ben Horowitz from the school coming up as well. So it's going to be a big show on the 7th of December in Wagga Wagga with those 3 comedians and the graduates from the school as well. But I digress. If someone likes what they hear, like your humility, think you're funny, and want to bring you to a sporting event, or maybe bring you more local into a room here in inner city Melbourne, how do they get in contact with James Masters?
Just Facebook me. James Masters, the comedian. Is my Facebook page, and I did that because there's a James Masters who's way more successful than me, who was on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So I have to specify that I'm James Masters the comedian. Message me through that, and I'll come to wherever you want and be really funny, or at least pretty funny.
That's good. Oh, fantastic. Well, I found you. I found you hilarious, and Yeah, your comedy hits me. I don't know. Maybe I like dildo jokes, but it's good.
Well, they never fail, mate. Actually, if I can have that question again about advice to upcoming stand-up comedians, right?
Yes.
All dildo-based humour.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, look, you can never get enough, I think.
No, that's true. No, people love it.
Well, James, thank you very much for your time. A pleasure to talk to you. And
thanks, Myron.
Welcome. And look, I'll bump into you, I'm sure, at one of the events very, very soon.
I reckon you probably will. Great talking to you, Myron. Appreciate it.
Cheers.